What I wanted to do was very quickly talk about some of the climate change science as an introduction to my colleagues who will give you more, let's say, relevant issues around. And so first of all, let's talk about the global temperature change. If we look at the last 100 years, 150 years, we have a sort of a slope like so. Last 100 years, over the last 50 years, the climate has been warming at about 0.13 degrees C per decade, and over the last 25 years, it's warming at a rate of 0.18 degrees C per decade. The evidence is unequivocal. The climate system is changing. It is getting warmer through both all kinds of observations. And I think the other thing we're seeing is that not only is the climate changing, but the analysis shows that humans are most of the cause. I'm in the business of natural hazards, so I think first of all I want to just very quickly say a hazard is something that may potentially cause us damage to a community, and vulnerability are the conditions determined by the physical, social, economic, environmental factors that determine how susceptible communities are. And it's when we get these two working together, disasters result when hazards hit a vulnerable community. So we have to deal with both factors here. If we look around the world at global natural disasters, and they're natural only in the sense they were triggered by an event such as weather, climate, we've gone from about 50 weather-related disasters per year in the 1960s to almost one per day in the first part of this century. If we look at them, of course, the economic costs are going up. And if we look at all of the disasters that happen around the world, although the earthquakes, when they happen, are really horrific, they are only a small number percentage-wise. Over 75% of the disasters around the world are caused or triggered by floods, storms, droughts, landslides, snowslides, things that are related to our weather and climate. So as our climate is changing, we are concerned about that. So is our climate going to be changing more in the future? I think the answer is yes. And we look at things such as on this side of the screen, your left, is various scenarios of possible future greenhouse gas emissions by the global community. And we look at the right side, your right side, how will the temperature change? So first of all, remember over the last 50 years, we're warming at a rate of 0.13 degrees C per decade. We'll be warming, then we've been warming at 0.18 for the last 25 years. And for roughly the next 25, 30 years, the scientific consensus is that we will warm at a rate slightly more, 0.2 degrees C per decade, independently of emission scenarios, because the climate system is still, quite frankly, catching up with the amount of greenhouse gases that human activities are put in. As we look towards the longer period of time, if we take a very optimistic scenario, we could in fact bring the rate of warming down to 0.15 degrees C per decade by the end of the century. But if we continue on a very pessimistic, upwards careening slope of greenhouse gas emissions, we could be warming at a rate of 0.8 degrees C per decade by the end of the century. That's what we might call our human choice. And we first of all have to recognize there is scientific uncertainty, and if we factor that in, we could be warming by a degree or so by the end of the century. We could be warming by as many as 7 degrees by the end of the century, and that is really, the latter number, really horrific. And the warming will continue for centuries to follow. So where are we going on our greenhouse gas emissions? Let's leave that to other audiences, but I just want to say that things are not looking great. This is from the Global Carbon Project, their latest report in 2007. If we look at the rate of increase of CO2 emissions into the atmosphere in the 1990s, it was going up at about 1.3% per year. We're now going up at 3.3% per year. And the projections, the actual measured amounts or estimated amounts for 2006 in terms of greenhouse gas emissions are larger than even the most pessimistic projections made only in the year 2000. So not looking very good. Anyway, if we look at a simple climate framework, we normally think of it going around in this kind of loop. And much of the discussion is on emission reductions, i.e. changing our socioeconomic development paths to reduce emissions. But what we're really going to talk about here in this workshop tonight is climate change adaptation, which is changing the way we do things in order to minimize the impacts of a changing climate, gain whatever advantages there may be, and trying to manage the unavoidable, as we might say. So, adaptation is defined in this way, making adjustments in our decisions, activities, and thinking. We can be informed by knowledge of current and projected impacts and vulnerability of. So it's a kind of thinking ahead, making choices, understanding that the climate is changing and it will evolve with time, so we need to step forward in an iterative kind of way. We need to build our adaptive capacity. That's the capacity of societies to be able to adapt to a changing climate. And this is all linked to disaster risk reduction. So very quickly, before I get the 2-minute warning gonger, remember, first of all, that no one lives at the global average. When we say that the global temperature is going to warm by 2.8 degrees Celsius, that means that most land areas are going to warm by over 3.5 degrees, and the northern regions of Canada, the Arctic, could be warming as much as 6 degrees Celsius. There's a very large northern expansion of this. We also need to look at precipitation patterns, and on a global basis, there are many places with reduced summertime precipitation, including the central interior of British Columbia, the southwestern Canadian prairies, areas that are already dry will in the summer get even drier. We'll also have, though, increased wintertime precipitation through actually most of Canada, including the coastal zones here. This means we need to look at our water supply systems, our flood management, hydropower, how do we deal with sewage, rethink what we're doing and how do we do it. I'm from Ontario now, although I grew up in Vancouver, so I just want to show you an Ontario event. These kind of things happen. This is August 19th, 2005. All this happened in a matter of minutes. A major street in Toronto is wiped out, and that hole in the ground, but more importantly, the water that went all over the place into people's basements cost the Canadian insurance companies $500 million in payouts for an event that lasted about 10 minutes. Those are the kind of events, that's not necessarily due to climate change, but we are now projecting that those kind of heavy precipitation events will be more likely, and again, we need to account for that in our planning. We will have more flash floods, more kinds of issues to deal with as we look to the future. As I've also said, we will also need to, I'm not sure why that slide, did I go the wrong way? Anyway, drought conditions, summer drying, the possibility of more fires in the interior, droughts on the prairies, again, agricultural systems, water supply systems. One of the things we worry about is tornadoes. You don't have many tornadoes in BC, but we have lots of them on the prairies and actually in southwestern Ontario where I live. And this is an example of a tornado hitting Ely, Manitoba, in which fortunately no one was killed, but that was the first F5 tornado to ever be known to happen in Canada. Not necessarily due to climate change, but the indications are that as we look to the future, the occurrence of these kind of severe weather events will increase in number. We've already, as mentioned by Deborah, the tragedy happening in Burma, the earlier tragedies of Katrina in New Orleans, etc. The number of those kind of cyclones may not go up in the numbers of them, but the magnitude, the intensity of them is going to increase with time. We're already seeing more high intense hurricanes happening, and that will continue into the future. With the melting of ice, we can only say we think there will be just a sea level rise. And again, we're concerned because if we look at the sea level rise over the last decade or so, is that the curve we're following, riding up that, do I dare touch this thing? Yes, riding up there, is where the sea level is now rising for the last decade or more at a rate which was on the upper edge of what we thought would have been possible. So in other words, we're going into the worst of the scenarios in terms of sea level rise. This, with the addition of the fact that storms in the future will be more intense, leads us to concerns about storm surges affecting coastal communities. Just want to mention in passing, we need to also worry about other things related to our health. As we have hot or drier conditions, we may have more mosquitoes, the spread of West Nile virus we've seen in the interior of British Columbia, with the warming winters, the overwintering of pests, etc., than the mountain pine beetle. So climate is changing. It is changing and affecting all kinds of our ecosystems, the society, etc. And we need to also remember that climate change is a long-term issue. It's an issue in my feeling about intergenerational and international equity, and it gets down to people like my two grandchildren and my wife. We worry about those people. I do, and I think you all do. And how is the climate we're leaving for them and for the people in, say, Africa, where they are being impacted by climate change, going to be such that they are having significant issues already now, and as the climate makes it more difficult for them in the future. So I'd like to, with that, thank you for your attention and pass it over to the next speaker, and of course end on this is the polar bear who is on very thin ice. Thank you.